Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. For the folks online, tune in. I really appreciate it. We're here in Glasgow, Scotland at COP26. This has been a phenomenal conference so far because there's been just so much issues that have been discussed that we really haven't talked about before. And one of the things that we're here to talk about today is really what's happening in our states, within the United States, that our federal government, our nation as a whole, has not been able to do. And really what that means for our future as a country, engaging in dealing with our climate issues, and certainly dealing with our international partners. So we're here as a part of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, which is a group, a trade group of about 1,200 legislators from all 50 states throughout the United States. It's bipartisan, all parties are represented. And we come from a number of different states. My name is Chris Lee. I'm a state senator in the state of Hawaii. Fortunate to be exactly the opposite side of the earth, so I'm completely messed up in my time zones, but happy to be here. And I want to introduce some of our other speakers here this morning. See, I just did it. This afternoon, this evening, whatever it is. But first, a note about this organization, NCEL, because it's been around for a couple decades now, and the kinds of policies that it's been able to push by connecting legislators in different states on common issues, to be able to share best practices, to be able to come up with solutions that work not in one place but elsewhere, and be able to spread those policies rapidly, has been able to make a difference decade after decade that we haven't been able to see, I think, on our national front. And in fact, we've been able to influence, as a collection of states, what kind of policies our nation as a whole adopts. And when we talk about climate, obviously this is perhaps the greatest challenge that certainly our nation and the planet has probably ever faced. And that's something that we hope to, again, influence. And I think we're starting to see that, and we really want to get into that today. And some of those nature-based solutions on oceans, on energy, on adaptation, and all these things are moving in ways that I don't think we could have talked about even a year or two ago. So it's a really exciting time. So with that, let me run into introducing a couple of our colleagues who are here. First is Dominique Jackson, who's a legislator from Colorado. And why don't we just start by introducing yourself and maybe highlighting a couple of things that Colorado is now doing that the nation as a whole has yet to do.
Okay. Thank you so much, Senator Lee. Hey, everybody. I'm so grateful to be here at COP26. It's my first time. So again, my name is Dominique Jackson. I am a state representative from Colorado, hailing from Aurora, Colorado, which is right on the border of Denver. Very diverse metro district. I run all kinds of different policy in the Colorado legislature, and of course am very interested and do a lot of environmental policy. So a couple of years ago ran a bill called the Climate Action Plan to Reduce Pollution, which was a first of its kind climate policy that reduced greenhouse gas emissions across several different sectors by certain percentages over a certain time frame. So great piece of legislation, loved it and everything. Well, things weren't not exactly going as planned. So this year ran some more legislation coming from both chambers of the Senate and the House, pairing both environmental justice and just codifying some of the things that we had in that other piece of legislation. And so, so this year we passed a bill that was an environmental justice bill, which gave true power and true voice. It was a very community-driven type of legislation that put together a group of people, a task force built of disproportionately impacted members across the state that will help to actually define what a DI, a disproportionately impacted community, is, because it's very difficult to do, as we have come to find out. You can talk to every academic on the planet. You can talk to every entrepreneur who's measuring every ounce of particulate matter. It's very difficult to do, and our state is starting off doing a really good job with the climate equity data viewer, has some ways to go, and so we gave this task force some of that information, and of course what the federal government is doing, and to start. But community gets to decide what a DI community really is, what a disproportionately impacted community is. And then there's also a board that will also be formed of many of these same task force members. And then and an ombudsman who is going to be responsible for making sure that everybody gets spoken to. My district, just in my school district alone, there's more than 130 different languages spoken. So we're talking about being able to talk to everybody across this state in the way in which they need to be spoken to at the time of day that they need to be spoken to, right? In the form, and not like tweeting, hey, hello, this orange stuff that's coming out of the air, that's a problem for you. Doing it in the way in which they need to be spoken to. At any rate, then fines and fees from these polluters, this board will get to decide how those fines and fees are going to be used in their own community to mitigate the harmful impacts of that pollution. And again, codifying the emissions reductions goals that we had set out in 2019. So that in a kind of a big nutshell is what we actually were able to accomplish last year. And my dear friend and colleague, Senator Faith Winter, is also here at COP26, wandering around somewhere. And I'm so grateful to her for running this legislation with me. But what I'm most grateful for are those community members, because we are just the conduits for this work. The work comes from community. The work comes from all of those people who have been historically marginalized and who have said, much like the people who have been marching since we've been here, who have said, look, my kids are sick. I'm tired of having to shelter in place. I'm tired of, not knowing what's happening, what's in the water. I'm tired of driving by the fence line monitor and not knowing what it's really reading. I'm tired of not being informed about what's coming out of that stack. I don't know what's happening in my community. I'm tired of some community down the road getting lawnmowers when I don't even have a lawn, and that's how they're mitigating. That's what the settlement is. What about my life? So anyway,
so you're really getting into economic justice and climate justice that you guys are doing that really nobody else has been.
Yes, and
yet.
I digress.
No, we're gonna dive into this into the weeds even further coming up. But real quick, let's get through everybody else. So up next, Don Oyer from Rhode Island. State legislator. What is it over there? You're on the opposite side of the country from us. We're like polar opposites here. But what are you guys doing that's really leading the nation right now?
But, we can unify around our islands. And so,
Oh, yeah.
Yep. My name's Dawn Oyer. I'm a state senator in Rhode Island, and I'm very excited to be here. So thank you, Chris, for moderating, and thank you to NCEL for having us here. It's also my first time at a COP, and I couldn't be more excited to be here. I think that there's so many great conversations that are coming today and ideas coming together. So Rhode Island this last year, so I also want to pump that Rhode Island is the first U.S. state to have domestic offshore wind turbines in the water. So we do have an offshore wind farm off of Block Island, and it's such remarkable. And to look at the progress that's being made in other offshore wind developments and what's to come, and to know how important Rhode Island was in starting that conversation domestically in the United States is really a point of pride for myself and everybody else in the Rhode Island General Assembly as they push that item forward at a time where it was just kind of a whisper and a dream to get that to happen in the United States. So that was a big victory for Rhode Island, and just this last year I was able to pass a bill that updated our climate targets, established a net zero goal by 2050 updated interim targets throughout the rest of our benchmark years, and also mandates the agencies to come together and come up with a plan on how to do that. And this legislation is enforceable. It's enforceable by citizen supervision, which to me is really exciting because that's how a lot of environmental legislation unfortunately needs to have teeth to it, because very often in the power struggle between the legislature and the executive branch, there are things that the legislature will say that the executive branch may not do in the way that the legislature intended. And environmental legislation falls in that category quite often. And so the history of environmental legislation and environmental enforcement comes with citizen supervisions because we are all human stewards of our environment. And so that this gives the ability for residents and citizens to be able to file injunctive relief to basically make the state step up and actually abide by the parameters of our law. And I'm so glad that Dominique brought up environmental justice, because we cannot have climate justice without environmental justice. And so Rhode Island's legislation also includes language around just transition. We need to look to the communities who have been disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of climate change, both the health impacts that come from the polluting industries, sea level rise, flooding that often hurts minority communities and economically oppressed communities much harder than they hit other communities. So, and also part of a just transition is also looking at workforce transition. If we're going to build a green economy, we need to envision a new way of thinking. We need to be protecting our workforce, and we need to be making sure that as we're transitioning to this new green economy, that it's an economy that works for the workers. So as we are moving away from the fossil fuel industry jobs, we need to make sure that we are creating jobs that pay a living wage so that people can support families off of these jobs. And all of those considerations are in Rhode Island's bill, that we have to create a plan that has all of those considerations in it so that we're building a future that works for Rhode Islanders. So I'm very excited that, for the panel today and to kind of dig in more to what we've been doing and all of those different issues. So thanks so much, Chris.
Awesome. And last but not least, here on the end of the line here, Reuven Carlyle, state senator from the state of Washington. You guys have been doing a ton of stuff just this year. Where do we begin?
Well, thank you. It's also my first time. It's just fabulous to be here at COP. And, one thing I think that a lot of folks may not quite understand about the U.S. system is that states play a very important role in the actual implementation of decarbonization. So the national government, of course, prints money, but the states are where the rubber meets the road in terms of implementation of decarbonization across the electricity sector, the transportation sector, all kinds of other categories. So again, thank you for moderating, Chris. So I'm Reuven Carlyle from Seattle. My state Senate district is in the heart and soul of Seattle, the Space Needle, the Gates Foundation, a small little mom and pop store you may have heard of called Amazon, and a number of other community assets. In the last 3 years, our state has passed a handful of comprehensive major bills. First and foremost, we have binding, enforceable level commitments to net zero. What does that mean for us? It means we emit about 100 million metric tons of carbon emissions. By 2050, we have to emit 5 million metric tons by continuing to grow our economy. So the deep decarbonization is incredibly challenging. In the last 3 years, we've passed an economy-wide cap and invest carbon pricing bill with the help of the Environmental Defense Fund, a number of other global thought leaders around the world. And it is fully our intent to join California and Quebec in the Western Climate Initiative with that legislation. We passed comprehensive 100% clean energy legislation, which is a deep decarbonization plan for the electricity sector. We believe it's the strongest 100% clean energy decarbonization plan in the United States. We passed comprehensive environmental justice legislation, very similar to Dominique in Colorado, has a lot of the guidelines that she outlined. We also passed a clean fuel standard. So the west coast of the United States, California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as our friends in British Columbia, now have a clean fuel standard, which is transforming the deep decarbonization plan for transportation. We're seeing biofuels for aviation and maritime, industrial use, long-haul trucking, and energy storage, and many other sectors. And that, of course, also opens the door for renewable hydrogen. A few other major bills are in the area of hydrofluorocarbons, deep decarbonization with the strongest HFCs joining California. Also, building standards and appliance efficiency standards have been adopted. And then finally, of course, electrification of transportation with EVs has been an important part. And then one final piece of legislation has been driven by the natural gas sector, where we are working very hard to figure out a comprehensive decarbonization plan for natural gas. And we have the regulatory authority in that area, and we'll be considering that next year.
That's a mouthful. Congratulations, all of you. So we really want to dive into this, but I'm not going to let you get off the hook yet without saying that, in our state too, in Hawaii, we also have a lot of these things that we're aspiring to. I think you guys have done more in many cases than what we've done, but we do have 100% renewable energy mandate by 2045. I think we still have the country's only carbon negative mandate, economy-wide, by that same date. And what's really exciting is this stuff was passed like 6 years ago, so it's not like we're going to be talking about this hypothetically. We know that in a lot of these cases, and some of the policies passed in these other states, as well as California and a number of others, that there are already results showing that these things work. They're economically beneficial, they're environmentally beneficial, they're equitable in a lot of ways that no one had ever thought possible. And that just opens the door to, well then, if this works here in all these different cases, why not throughout the country? Why not a federal policy? Why not international policies that are adopted to do the exact same thing? So let me throw it back to you guys. When we talk about international or national politics versus states and subnational governments, why is it that we're the ones leading the way? And really, what are those strategies? How is it that this stuff can get passed? And then how do we replicate that at a bigger level?
Well, why is it? I mean, I think that it's I mean, I think it's about that voice. I mean, can you hear me? I think it's about that voice. I mean, I think it's about that cacophony of voices. I think it's about that roar, that comes from community. I think that comes from the people. And I think that it rises. And I think that we learn from each other. Many of the things that Reuven was talking about, we have also done in Colorado, and we learn from each other. We share resources and we share ideas, and not everything works necessarily in the same way for every state, but we pick and we choose, and we figure out what works for each state, and then collectively we build power. That's what I believe.
Yeah, and I think there's so much of the policy, the nuts and bolts of what the policies are that are going to get us to this decarbonized future that is controlled by the states. It's controlled by the state legislatures. It's controlled by the state agencies. We do power, like our agencies do the power purchasing agreement. So, many of our states have worked on getting to 100% renewable energy. So for the electric sector, how does that happen? So we can have national goals and have conversations that are importantly driven at the national level, and the international commitment and bold vision. And it's up to the states and the localities to really implement that. But I also think part of what's happening is that we are dealing with the negative impacts on a very close level, on the local level, on the state level. I mean, so the district I represent is a coastal community. So when you look at Rhode Island, if you look up Rhode Island on the internet, and you'll see Newport, Rhode Island. That's the district that I represent. It's on all the postcards. It's beautiful. We're going to be underwater. Our utilities are so close to the water. We have different storms that come in, and that inundation that we get from storm surge. We have to deal with that on the municipal level, on the state level, those negative impacts. So naturally, having to be at the level of government that is addressing those problems very directly, it only makes sense that we're trying to also drive solutions at the same time.
I think the other thing that we have is a deep humility about evidence-based best practices. We take so much pride in being authentic about deep decarbonization strategies that have been shown to work in other states and around the world. Washington State has a very close relationship with the Nordic countries, so we're fiercely focused on evidence-based best practices around building efficiency and circular economy, and so many of the evidence-based best practices that show decarbonization pathways around sustainability. So global shipping. Washington State, Seattle is a day closer by ship to Asia than San Francisco. So the maritime industry in our state is incredibly important. We're the home of Boeing, so we have an incredibly robust aviation sector. So we're looking at renewable hydrogen relative, as well as electrification for regional jets. We're also the home of Starbucks and Amazon and Microsoft. So thought-leading companies that have a deep commitment to decarbonization requires a sector-based strategy and an economy-wide strategy. So, for example, many of the companies that we're talking about, 90% of their emissions is in their scope 3. So we're trying to ask the central policy question: what is the role of the state in helping decarbonize scope 3? It's not just out there in the world to help aviation and maritime and global supply chains. We have to help that. And that means making biofuels available at our port and our airports, things like that. So playing a role in production and distribution. We're a hydro state. We have about 60+% of our energy from hydro. So we have the ability to get into the renewable hydrogen business relative to electrolyzers and other systems. So we're looking at those types of best practices from around the world. We're about 8 million people as a state, which is the size close to Israel and Denmark and Norway. So all of these countries and states have relative sizes. That's where evidence-based best practices from each other and from around the world are made possible.
And let me follow up on that, because is it fair to say, I mean, we have 50 different states in our country alone, and so many others have sometimes even more. They're so very different from coast, except for Rhode Island and Hawaii. Apparently we're both islands, but everybody else is very different.
We're the same.
And that gives, I think, different political opportunity to be able to actually pass successfully different policies that may not be possible in one state but are possible in another. So is it fair to say that really these are the laboratories, the experimental places where policies can go, be vetted, put into practice, and if they work, then be adopted elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And you know, being again from Rhode Island, we're small but mighty, and you know, so we look at, you know, we were talking earlier prior to the panel about, you know, what does it look like to influence market share, right? But you know, the ability that we have in Rhode Island is our agility, right? Because we're smaller and we have the ability to try things out that maybe other states that maybe are a little bit less agile in that thinking would be willing to do. But you know, also we also like to look to what other states, we look at, you know, what works well, what didn't work well, how we can adapt it, and how we can make it so that it works for us locally, because you know, something that worked on the West Coast might not work in Rhode Island.
Well, another example of that for us very specifically is we passed cap and invest carbon pricing this year, the most sweeping legislation. And we did that in partnership with California and Quebec. We listened deeply to their success and their failure. They helped us craft the bill with a lot of thought leaders from around the world, and we learned those lessons, and we wrote the legislation with them to understand how to have a deep decarbonization across your entire economy is incredibly challenging. So we have about 125, 130 large emitters that emit over 25,000 metric tons a year. Kaiser, Alcoa, Boeing plant, Weyerhaeuser, food processors, many others, like many states do. And so having a deep decarbonization plan for them that is market-based, but also allows us to link up with California and Quebec, but to do so while controlling the governance. And so having equity and parity of that. We also, again, going back to the environmental justice issue, we made a big move in the area of measuring criteria pollutants as opposed to just CO2. And the difference from that, we were talking earlier, is incredibly profound because it means that you're measuring the actual pollution on the ground in real life for real people. And so the ability to have regulatory authority over criteria pollutants is a transformational change in the area of environmental justice. And that's what got a lot of support for the Cap and Invest bill, which of course has a lot of critiques on the left. And so that was an important part of the grand bargain, was to get that partnership in place.
So on that, you talked about working with Quebec and some of the other neighbors around you. I really want to dive into this because I think there's a long history amongst this organization, amongst the member states working together and collaborating, going actually back to the 80s when a California state senator at the time had proposed tailpipe emission standards, which was the first time that had ever been done in the United States, at least to my knowledge. And that ended up passing in California. Other states looked at that. That was shared through legislator to legislator, peer-to-peer dialogue, and those states began adopting something similar. And pretty soon, you have this growing exponential road toward regulating emissions from cars. And that forced our national government to act, and that's how we got the emission standards we now have today at the federal level. But fast forward 20 years, do you guys see this as an opportunity, that same strategy, that same model of using one state success to replicate, to affect some of the issues that we're now dealing with today when it comes to climate and justice and all those things? And what do you see actually moving?
Look, I'm certainly not going to pretend like I'm an expert. There are so many smarter minds than mine, and I'm always seeking information. And when I'm trying to learn something, when I'm trying to do something, I'm picking up the phone, and these are the people I'm calling who have already done it before. And I'm asking the questions, and I'm trying to learn what their lessons are. And I'm trying to learn, more than anything else, what the opposition has been, what the problems have been, what the pitfalls have been. And so, and the longer that has gone on, the more that I've learned. And same with the federal government. They're going to be learning the exact same things. And so, and then collectively, like we've talked about, collectively, that movement, that power, that energy that comes from what is working, what we've learned, and society as a whole. Nothing gets done without voice. Nothing gets done without voice. I know that as a lawmaker, I am looking to my local elected officials. I'm looking at my city council members. I'm looking at my school board members, right? I'm looking at my county commissioners because I'm in that building, I'm in that golden dome, and I'm not necessarily always cognizant of everything that's going on in certain areas that they are, right? And I know that my congressional delegation is in DC, and they're also looking at me and every other member of the legislature, and we're talking. It's not like we're not working together. We're talking. And they're also looking to me to try and find out, what are people saying? What do people need? What are you doing? What's working? Help me here. We're all in this together. And so yes, absolutely, that's how it works.
So let me go further. What are those issues within that climate space that we see as most fruitful and most likely to just replicate across the country?
Well, one example is the 100% clean energy standard. It is sweeping the nation. Hawaii went first. I personally was deeply inspired by Chris's work. The state of Hawaii took a huge step forward, but a lot of the 100% clean energy bills that have passed around the nation are relatively aspirational. And they're, I don't want to say theoretical, but they're aspirational. So as time has gone on, they've gotten deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of being more enforceable and more actionable. So the deep decarbonization of the electricity sector is happening in the United States because of states. And if you look at Colorado as an oil and gas related state, they have very different challenges than a state that doesn't have that kind of infrastructure. If you look at a small state, so every state, in our state, we're part of the Western regional issues are very different in terms of grid modernization. I think the new federal bill that is moving forward has a lot of money on grid modernization. We need a modern grid in order to have real-time interaction of wind, hydro, solar, nuclear, other renewable sources, and I think that that's an example where we see around the country a movement is that in the deep decarbonization of the electricity sector. There's many others, but that's one that's very specific because of state collaboration.
And I think, to me, it's so exciting where the conversation is on electricity right now, and it is because of states. And, now the conversations that I've been having with folks in thinking about that in the other sectors, right? So like transportation and buildings are like the two places where we're farther behind, right? And there's so much to do in those sectors. But it's the same thing and the same themes that we've been talking about, where the states really have the opportunity to lead and push those issues forward, because the states really, transportation, the states control the budget. We control what roads are built, and if the state continues to double down on car-centric infrastructure, we're going to be stuck with car-centric infrastructure for the next generation. So we've got this huge infrastructure bill that passed, which is great. And now it's up to the states to make sure that as we're spending that money, as we're spending that infrastructure money, that we're doing that embedding climate goals into those expenses, into those budgets. When we're building our transportation infrastructure, it needs to be comprehensive, needs to include active transportation, it needs including bike, pedestrian. By the way, that's good for our seniors too. So that's like a good, people as they get older, they can't drive anymore. They want to be able to walk safely. People like to be able to commute to work by bike. They're not going to do it if the infrastructure isn't built in a manner where they're able to do it safely. Those things are good for health. They're good for the environment. They're going to get us to our climate goals. But states could also take another turn, and we could spend all of that money and basically throw our climate goals out the window in the way that we decide to spend that money. So I think that to me is like one of the most urgent conversations that needs to happen, especially in light of the infrastructure bill that just passed.
And, sorry, did you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
A quick time check. We're more than halfway now, so I do want to save some time for just a general discussion and questions from folks who have any, because this is a rare opportunity where we have multiple states with multiple political laboratories who can take. We go into session in January. All state legislatures around the country. We have months to really change whatever we want. So if there are ideas out there for policies, for things that people want to see, we can bang that around and figure out where that kind of thing can be implemented, where we can set the bar so that the rest of the nation can follow. And that's just so incredibly exciting, because you got 50 opportunities, not just one. And clearly there's been success, and I'm looking at you guys smiling, because I feel like this is how things are going to change, right? It's people from the ground up coming together. But on that point, let's talk real quick about how at the state level, which is a much smaller entity than a federal government or a national government, how do we incorporate, and how do you guys in your states incorporate community? And I think you had mentioned, when you talk about economic justice and the stuff that you're working on, how do you get those voices to the table to make sure that they're actually engaged in a way that is meaningful for the public, so that the results are legitimate and people can buy into them and they are going to do what people expect them to do?
Yeah, codify their involvement. I mean, you make sure that it's not just a bunch of attorneys sitting in a dark room. You make sure that they are involved in rulemakings. I mean, you put it in statute. I mean, you give it to them. That's what you do. You say, look, you lay it on the table. It's like, no, this belongs to you. This is about you. This is your community. This belongs to you. and you make it accessible. It's not 9 to 5. It's not Monday through Friday. It's not all in English, and it involves childcare. I mean, you make it accessible in every way, shape, or form, and you codify those exact things. That's how you bring people to the table.
Do you guys get a lot of engagement at your state capitals and in your communities? What does that actually look like, and how do you translate that?
Yeah, I think definitely the COVID has made that incredibly challenging, as with many other things. So there's been, the transition to remote hearings and remote session. We don't do remote sessions in Rhode Island, but we've been doing remote committee hearings. And I think it's been an interesting dialogue about whether or not that actually gives more access or less. And I think that, as Monique was saying, the thing that we have to think about when we are engaging with community and collaborating with community is understanding that not everybody is coming to you from the same place and from the same perspective, and not everyone has internet access. Not everyone can afford a phone that has internet capability to hop on a Zoom and then wait for 5 hours. But at the same time, I also heard from people who are like, this is great because I don't have 5 hours to sit at the state capitol waiting my turn to be called. I can be at home with my kids. Childcare. I can be at home with my kids, making them dinner and making sure they get their homework done. And also, I'm here at home, and when I get called to testify, I can get called to testify. So I personally have been really struggling with how that's going to move towards the future, and how we learn the good lessons learned from COVID, and how we can make adjustments to how we are interacting with folks at our state capitol, because I think there's a lot to reflect on, and I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I think for me, one of the biggest things, and I come from a history of activism. I was an activist long before I was elected, never thought I would run for office. And my entire perspective in getting involved in politics and getting involved in policy is that nothing is baked until the bill is signed. And we have to encourage our younger generation and folks who are getting engaged on these issues. It's not done until it's done. We need to believe in the politics of the possible. The engagement that people have in these issues, the conversations that you have with elected leaders, with the people around elected leaders, it matters. It absolutely matters. We do listen. I work with people from all sorts of, political ideologies in the State House. But what we all share is a belief in public service, and that we're there because we want to do the business of the people. And so I think for me, having that hope to go along with the anger, the justified anger that people have at this moment in our political history, those two things need to go hand in hand, because these things don't change overnight. They change with sustained engagement from committed people who want to see things be different than they are right now. And every single person has the ability to make that change in their own way, because it all adds up to collective action and collective influence, and that's how we make big things happen.
So in addition to discovering ways to engage in community, I think we also have to look at the undertone of some of the deeper issues that are happening. So in the United States, we have a real urban-rural divide. It isn't just a party issue. It is core, and it is impacting our ability to decarbonize and transform our conversation about the agriculture sector. It's impacting our ability to talk about the timber industry and the role, the potential of biomass. We look up here, it says invest in nature. It says accelerate deep decarbonization and invest in nature. The impact of nature in so many communities is so profound. It isn't just communities that are next to a industrial area, industrial park, or a highway. It's also rural areas that are impacted by wildfires. Investing in riparian areas. We have in our state 29 federally recognized tribes. The role of our indigenous community, the tribal role in our state, is profoundly important. It was central to passage of our Cap and Invest program, our Clean Fuel Standard program, and many other investments in transportation infrastructure, public infrastructure that you talked about. So how we engage rural communities to own the work of climate action touches, again, on agriculture, which touches on our food systems. And we can't have rural communities feeling that there's a self-righteous judgment about how the industrialization of our agriculture sector doesn't have a role in decarbonization. They do. We've got to figure that out. If you go to the COP26 panels and hearings, so much of it is about global agriculture. How do we talk about that in the United States? It means engaging rural communities. We're not doing that as well. So when we all talk, all of us, about engaging community, we have to find ways to give that voice across the spectrum and across categories.
So I agree with you completely, and just to add, so I believe in full transparency. So the things that I'm talking about, when I talk about talking to all communities, I'm not just talking about BIPOC communities. I'm not just talking about communities that look like me. I am talking about every corner in my state, every corner of my state. I'm talking about frontier. I'm talking about rural. I'm talking about urban. I'm talking about suburban. I'm talking about mountain, because I care about every corner of my state. I care about every person on this planet, honestly. But I believe that having that access, creating that access, uncovers what people think is this weird little world that they may or may not understand. But it's really not all that complex. And when people become to understand that they have a role in this, they have a voice in this, and it's really not all that complex, then hey, maybe I might step up to the plate. Maybe I might tell somebody what I really think. Because I'm going to tell you something, I, for one, am going to be here to listen. I don't care who you are. And that is what creates change.
And to that end, let me put this in context, because there are tens of thousands of people marching right now outside the doors here demanding swift action on a whole litany of things. And you know, they may or may not get out of COP26 at the national level the kinds of international agreements that I think people hope for and demand. And that's been the case for every COP going back to the beginning of time. But the last time that kind of pressure and that kind of engagement was applied at a local level in individual states, where you don't have, and you don't need tens of thousands of people showing up, but the last time in Hawaii, for example, we had a few hundred people show up. We ended up with enough political momentum to expand a protected area, to create the largest protected area on the surface of the planet. And that was a huge win for our oceans and oceans policy, and that was something that was done with this kind of momentum, but applied in a different manner through a different mechanism. And I think states in particular are small enough creatures, for the most part, that can actually produce results that you really can't see anywhere else. So with that, let me just say we're closing in on toward the end of this. But you know, I'd mentioned earlier, what were the things that really you guys have to ask us, because there's this enormous opportunity come January to start filling up the agendas with what's next. Yes.
Lots of hands. We need a mic.
Hi, I'm Dr. Deb Morrison from the University of Washington, great state of Washington. And so Article 11 of the Paris Agreement and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement talk about capacity building and education training, public awareness, public access to information, all of that. So as you say, most of this work is state, local kind of work. So what might policies look like in your states that would address these, and how would you fund them and make them publicly substantially justice-centered?
Well, you can't talk to me because I've come from a state that has this very weird thing. It's the only state in the union, something called taper, so I'm just going to be quiet.
So I'll just jump in real quickly on that. So our Cap and Invest bill is expected to raise $7.2 billion over 16 years. About 70% of that is allocated to the broader transportation sector, decarbonizing transportation sector, and about 30% for additional investments. But 35 to 40% of that money is going to be directed into disproportionately impacted communities relative to criteria pollutants, GHGs, a whole bunch of different investments. The deeper issue of giving voice, of how to spend those resources, of how to engage, that is real money, and it's on the ground for real people living real lives. And I think by embedding in the concepts of environmental justice and equity as the DNA of those decisions, you give community a sense of voice, but it allows us to have conversations about decarbonizing some of our most difficult sectors, which touches on jobs, it touches on labor and organized labor and unions, it touches on stakeholders across the sectors. So giving voice, being transparent, engaging the public, that's what makes states powerful. We're all part-time citizen legislators. In Washington, D.C., members of Congress, God love them, they're doing their best, but the job is fundraising, making speeches, and hammering out a deal once in a while. And most members of Congress pass an amendment to a banking bill every 4 years. We are writing legislation on the front lines every day. Giving voice to community is what we have to do or we won't go back. And so the essence of Paris, having binding commitments to Paris at the state and local level, is achievable.
I would add to that too and jump in by saying things cost money, for sure. We need that investment. We got to find that somewhere. But if you break it down, states and countries are paying, taxpayers, regular people, citizens are paying already for the impacts of climate change, paying for the impacts of fossil fuels and everything else. It's really, I think, a question of wrapping your mind around that in a different way as a policymaker. Say, all right, how do we better spend our resources? Rather than cleaning up this problem, why don't we invest on the front end and get a better result from the beginning? And that's something that I think a lot of places have not yet got to, but is there.
Hi there. Thank you for this really great event. And I'm very glad right at the end you started talking about oceans, which is what I wanted to ask my question about. My name's Keon. I'm the Global Goals Ambassador for Climate Action with the UN Foundation, UNA USA. And it's great we have 3 coastal states here, which is why it's good to talk about oceans. Really want to take advantage of this
Oh,
opportunity.
you don't love the landlocked state, huh?
I would love to hear your answer, but you may not have an answer for this one. So as you mentioned, there are some landmark marine protected areas that were recently introduced. And over the last few years, you have like Papahanaumo Kwakea. I'm sorry for the pronunciation.
It's okay, even President Obama got it wrong.
Yeah. So in studying the legal structures behind that, which something that's really important to note is that it was based off of cultural heritage. That was the basis for it. And you created a system of sister sites. So now there's so much land protected, and it's a no-take, which means there's a lot of protections. But going forward, for other coastal states that don't have the opportunity to use cultural heritage as a means to protect, I'd love to hear your experience in that process, but also, other marine protected areas potentially in the pipeline, what you've learned as what we can do to establish more greater marine protected areas to meet the targets for 2030, considering we missed some of the 2020 targets, and how we can use conservation and other means to justify those marine protected areas effectively. And the small note is that Hawaii as a state got to implement that marine protected area as well, governing. So how can states govern their marine protected areas as well? So sorry that was long-winded. Thank you.
Sure. No, I'll try and be as quick about it as I can. I think the original effort to try, and we have to give a lot of credit to President Obama and our senators, our U.S. senators, Brian Schatz, who really pushed the effort at the federal level forward. I was involved, and some of our colleagues were involved in helping to fill the gap and get the public engaged and build support for something so that they had the political momentum to go and execute. And in the beginning, there wasn't that cultural focus, certainly not nearly what it became. And that was a huge problem because we were fighting industrial fishing and all kinds of other international pressures to try and do something, and it wasn't going that great. and there was a lot of pushback. But the minute people started opening their eyes and saying, wait a minute, this area has been managed by a Native Hawaiian community for eons, why not engage them and bring them to the table in a way where they have a guaranteed seat, where they have rights and in perpetuity access. And that was something that brought an entire new system of support from an entire new community on board in a way that was really productive and helped push this thing over the line. So I think where there is opportunity, and not every coastal area has that, but where there's opportunity is absolutely the way to go. You're going to be coming out with a win no matter what, no matter, yeah, I mean, it's just, there's just no arguing that. In other places, I'm going to defer to the others about other places, and let me shut up for the moment, but take it away.
Well, what I'm going to say is actually this is one thing that NCEL has been helpful with. I was part of a NCEL delegation a few years ago where we went down to DC to lobby against the offshore oil leasing. And so, you know, that's another place where, you know, we had basically the entire Atlantic coastline, states from the entire Atlantic coastline down in DC, you know, pushing. There was, they were trying to sneak some leasing into the defense bill. And then there was like a couple different places where it looked like the leasing was going to be in. And, you know, as he said, we're part-time legislators, and it's enough to kind of keep up on what we've got going on in our other states. They're tracking the federal issues. NCEL was a really great resource to help bring us all together and have us have a unified voice of a coalition of coastal states to really oppose additional offshore oil drilling. And so I think that you know, doing that collective action amongst states is hugely important. I'll also say that Rhode Island, and one of the things that actually brought me to Rhode Island is Rhode Island did basically offshore zoning. So before we did our offshore wind, we did the special area management plan. And so that actually, and we did, so it essentially is urban planning, but in the ocean. So to really think about what our ocean resources are, what the future uses are going to be, what do we want to protect, and how, because we knew that we wanted to do an offshore wind farm. We also know that there's sensitive areas we need to protect, and actually we now in Rhode Island have protection under federal consistency provisions that we actually get to say. There's wind turbines going in off the coast of New York that actually impacts our fisheries that we get to weigh in on because of this offshore planning that we've done and the federal consistency provisions in the law. So I think looking at things like that where the state, we're off in federal waters telling New York what they can and can't do with offshore wind because of that planning process we did.
Yeah, other questions? We got time for probably one or two more.
Thank you. I'm a state legislator in California, so I know what you guys go through, and this is really inspiring and super exciting. I was going to say, if you could each go through and say what's one thing that you're most excited, either a specific bill for next year or a topic that you're most excited to tackle next year.
Man, you just opened a can of worms there. I'll very quickly say I chair the Transportation Committee in our Senate, and looking at all the money that we currently spend on, a 19th, 20th century transportation system, if we just repurpose even a fraction of that, we could create so much opportunity for people who otherwise are forced into expensive vehicles, often fossil fuel-based vehicles, and with a quality of life that is diminished because they're spending hours sitting in traffic rather than living in a place where they can commute by bike or by public transit or something else that is way more efficient, way more clean, and incredibly cheaper than what they're paying. So we're looking at completely retooling our transportation infrastructure and the money we spend, and especially, fingers crossed, the federal support that we'll be getting as a state, hopefully in the next week or two, so that we take advantage of that and it doesn't continue to just double down on a broken system.
I am currently chairing a committee actually that is doling out ARPA funds for housing. And so I am really excited about, obviously there's going to be lots of solutions, but we need to build. And so I am excited about thinking about how we save ratepayers money and how we build some sustainable and energy efficient multifamily housing. and how we deal with split incentives in repurposing and rehabilitating existing housing. So I'm really looking at density and some other issues, but that's what I'm just this other frontier of housing is a human right, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in housing. That's what I'm excited about.
We have an environmental justice bill that I was able to get through the Senate, but not through the House, and so, and it looks at, cumulative health impacts that I think is going to be critically important as we move towards our climate goals. So I'm really excited to go all in on that bill next year and hopefully get it to the governor.
I would say two things. One is I hope to double down on every level on renewable hydrogen and make Washington State a national hub and a global hub, and based on best practices from Nordics as well as Japan and many others. And then, I think ultimately sort of transportation, the electrification of transportation, we're still only at a few percentage points, all of us as a state, and we have to get to Norway level 50, 60, 70%, and that just means radical transformation of a lot of our approach.
So we're just about out of time, but let me just give everybody a quick opportunity to wrap up, and maybe what are the big takeaways from this experience here at this COP, and how do we translate everything we're talking about into next steps in the United States and in our respective states. And then for myself, I'll just wrap up by saying, this has been such a great experience. I think collaborating with folks and the networks that exist that not a lot of us, I think, are aware of. When you have peer-to-peer opportunity to share best practices and move stuff around, that empowers everybody out there to call up their own legislator in their own state, who, unlike I think typical national leaders, are going to actually answer the phone and talk to you and be able to articulate to them, this is what we want to do. Go do it. And when they go do that, that translates to all the rest of us who are working on that stuff, and that turns into national and international change. And so that, for me, is the most exciting thing. And oh my God, I can't wait to get back. So with that, let me hand it over to you guys.
For me, all of this has been exceptionally exciting. The energy, just filling up my soul again, to do the work. And then, of course, the ideas. From being on the train, walking around here, the people that I'm meeting, every single conversation is a blessing and a jewel. And so it's an incredible experience. And, coming into this, some of the things, you might have heard or you might have read is like, what's going to happen? Is it going to be worthwhile? Oh, baby, yeah, it's worthwhile.
I think for me, my takeaway really is, this climate change is a crisis. It's a global problem, but really we need local solutions and solutions that work for people on the ground. And so, being able to be with colleagues from the state legislature has been really a great experience, again, to be able to share ideas, because there's such an important cry for us to actually take action and to actually see where we can continue to be a driving force on the state level to continue to move these policies forward aggressively. It's very exciting to be part of that.
So I also have enjoyed it all, and I think those best practices are the driver of so much of the progress we've made. I think for me, the deep systems issues of decarbonization across electricity, transportation, agriculture, our relationship with food, our smart cities, our density, how we handle data, how data moves around is now a climate issue. I think what thought leadership looks like is, what are the premier organizations in the world, the premier nonprofits, the premier companies, premier governments who really are leading edge in deep decarbonization, is the only way we're really going to hit net zero. It's the only way we're going to hit Paris. It's the only way we're going to have the level of progress in tough to decarbonize sectors. And so for me, those best practices, thought leadership, and really the moral authority that those of us on the ground, all of us, bring to this work is just more than aspirational. And I think that's what people are hungry for. That's what the protesters want. That's what our children and our grandchildren want. That's why we're all here. So the movement of this era requires action on the ground, and I think that's the power and the voice that states bring.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And thanks for getting involved.